All right, so completing the square. Do you remember back when we first started factoring in Chapter 9, and we had those two special cases? And I said, I know this one's a little trickier than the other one, but you really need to know it, because when we get to Chapter 10, we're going to do some things with it. And if you don't remember that, well, that day is here. Chapter 10 is here, completing the square. So let's kind of refresh our memory a little bit. If I had, say, a plus 5 times an a minus 5, when you FOILed that out, you found that you had a squared minus 5a plus 5a, and then negative times positive, right? And those ended up canceling. So do you remember back to this day? You should be pretty comfortable with that now. That was what everybody kind of thought was the easy one. Then I gave you the other one where I said, okay, not a plus 5, a minus 5, but a plus 5 times a plus 5. And just like there was a shortcut for this one, there was a shortcut for this one. So let's kind of see what that shortcut was. It was a squared plus 5a, and then plus another 5a, so that they didn't cancel. Remember, they doubled. And then that positive 5 times this positive 5 meant that this end sign was always going to be a plus. Because even if those were minuses in the middle, wouldn't that still be a plus? Because a negative times a negative is a positive. So instead of canceling these two out, we doubled them, and we had 10a plus 25. Do you remember that? That was called factoring or FOILing a perfect square trinomial. Right? Okay. So if I started you, and remember, then it got to the point where they weren't written out like that. They were written like that, weren't they? So on the quiz for factoring, many of you, if we started with this, you factored it into 2 parentheses, but I really wanted you to put that as 1 like that. So, for example, if I had a squared plus 14a plus 49, and you factored it, you started off like this, and you said a times a, positive with positive means both the same, and then you went, oh, hey, that's a perfect square, that's a perfect square, must be 7 and 7, right? So is this ringing a bell? But I really wanted you to kind of prepare yourself to get the answer written like that. Because, let me just look at this real quick. We know what that means, doesn't it? Doesn't that look like vertex form? That's why I wanted you to get comfortable writing it like that instead of like 2. Okay, so now that we're a little familiar with a perfect square trinomial, let's talk about completing the square, which means going backwards. So if I have an x squared plus a 20x plus blank, and I'm telling you, this is a perfect square trinomial, and if this is a perfect square trinomial, what does that have to be? So stop for a minute and think about it. Basically, 20 was doubled, right? So what was 20 before it got doubled? 10, okay? So 20 before it got doubled was 10, and to get this, I take the square root of this one and the square root of this one. So if this is 10, what must 10 have started out as? 100, right? Okay, so let's put this in right here. Can I ignore that? And let's see if this makes sense. Is the square root of x squared x? Yes. Is the square root of 100 10? Yes. What's 10 times x? 10x. And when I double it, I get 20. Let's do that again. Let's take x squared minus 16x plus blank. In order for this to be a perfect square trinomial, what has to go there? I want you to think about it. I want to go back up here for a minute. didn't I take the square root of each of the ends? So 14 was doubled. Actually, something was doubled to get 14, and it was 7. And then 49 came from that 7 squared, right? So let's undo that process. So instead of doubling, what's the opposite of doubling? Dividing it by 2. So let's take that 16 and divide it by 2. That gives me 8. And 8 is the square root of this number, so this number must be 64. Okay. If you followed that just from kind of logical thinking, great. If you didn't, I'm going to give you a formula that you will use every time instead of just having to stop and think about it, okay, if that's making you nervous. So basically what we're doing with our x squared plus bx plus blank, you will get that blank every time by taking this coefficient, whatever it is, dividing it by 2, and then squaring it. Divide it by 2, then square it. Because that undoes taking the square root and doubling it, right? If you think about it. So that's how this happened. Purple. You take half of your coefficient for the middle term, because it's the opposite of doubling, and square it. All right? So let's try this one. You know what? That's a great question. Somebody asked that. You kind of get to ignore the sign in front of it because just leave it there. Just look at it as 16 and half of 16 and then double it. Because even if you did, if it was a negative, that would be a negative 8. And negative 8 squared is still 64. So it's easier to just kind of pretend like it's not there. All right. Use whatever method you need to see if you can figure out what goes in that blank, meaning what did that start out as? Take half, then square it. Not double it. That's going the other way. Take half, then square it, Nadia. 25. Yep, because half of 10 is 5, and 5 squared goes there. Good? Okay.
Half and then double and just give you the same answer.
What's that?
No,
half and then doubled. 5 doubled is 10.
Yeah, just take away the meaning of taking half of it.
Yeah. So now that you've completed the square, you need to factor it. So you know what to do for factoring. And guess what? It's going to be factored and it's going to look like that. You don't get to do 2 sets of parentheses today. If it's a perfect square trinomial, it's the same thing multiplied by itself. So what is the square root? Now that I know it, it's just x plus 5 squared, isn't it? So if I were to go back and factor this perfect square trinomial, it would be what? X minus, because whatever this is goes here. The sign of the middle term is the middle sign in your parentheses. And then what's the square root of 64? So, do you see that? X squared minus 16x plus 64 factored into that. Yes? What would this factor into? X plus square root of 100 is, so x plus 10 squared. That's what you're aiming for. You need to not only be able to complete the square, but you need to be able to factor it as well. Okay?